Yes, I'm limping. Why am I limping? Because I've got a bit of tendonitis. Yes, tendonitis is a common injury that people get. What is tendonitis? Itis means inflammation of tendon. So the inflammation of the tendon. Generally, tendonitis comes from, it's more of an overuse injury, a repetitive strain injury, which means you use the joint where the tendon goes across and it gets used so much you don't allow enough time to recover. That tendon tends to wear down, starts to inflame, called tendonitis. If it starts to wear out, where you get a worn out tendon, it becomes tendinopathy. If it actually snaps, then that's called a tendon tear, and one leads to the other, leads to the other. So if you start to get tendonitis, make sure it doesn't lead to tendinopathy, and make sure it doesn't eventually lead to a tendon tear. What's important is to get on top of the injury before it gets on top of you. Now, tendonitis tend to occur at many tendons in the body, and I've had most of them over my 53 years, starting with shoulder tendonitis of the supraspinatus tendon in the shoulder joint. I've had that quite a few times, had to manage that. I've had bicep tendonitis in both arms. I've had medial epicondylitis and lateral epicondylitis, which is tendonitis across the elbow. I've had patella tendonitis, not so bad, that didn't really get on top of me. And I've also had things such as, at the moment, I've got tendonitis in the foot in the form of plantar fasciitis. So I'm actually treating that at this particular time. So yes, there occurs also the patella tendonitis, which I've had in the past. So what's important is that you get on top of it before it gets on top of you. Now there's different stages of tendonitis, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. When you get the symptoms of stage 1, make sure you treat it properly so it doesn't get to stage 2. Because once it gets to stage 3 and beyond, then it can become impossible to recover, because there's so much scar tissue there, such wearing that the body can't actually regenerate, and therefore now you've got a long-term condition that cannot be reversed. So make sure you reverse it when it gets to stage 1. So stage 1 is where you start to feel it maybe when the tendon's cold first thing in the morning, you feel a bit stiff, you go, wow, that's a bit sore, I feel that. But once you warm up a bit, then you can't feel it anymore. So the blood flow and the increase of warmth takes the pain away, acts as an analgesic, therefore you can't feel it. So that doesn't mean it's not there, it's just being masked. So if you can start treating at that stage, then it won't get to the next stage, which is stage 2. So stage 1, you don't feel it at rest, you don't feel it when you're exercising, you tend to feel it when you start moving, when you're cold first in the morning. So when I get up in the morning, I'm starting to limp. Now that's stage 1. Once I'm warmed up, I've got to be careful that that false sense of pain-free range, I continue exercising, that caused the injury in the first place, will actually lead it to stage 2. Stage 2 is where it feels a bit sore while you're exercising as well. So it's sore when you're cold and you first get up, and once you start moving, it may get a little bit better, but you can still feel it, so it starts to affect your performance. Stage 1, it doesn't affect your performance, it's only you feel it when you're cold and moving around, but once you're warmed up, your performance is fine. Stage 2, it starts to affect your performance, and stage 3 is where you feel it when you're passive, when you're sitting on the couch and you start to get pain, or with throbbings of pain. You feel it when you move around, you feel it when you warm up, so it's constant there. If you keep exercising, think it's going to go away, it's not. You start to develop a lot of scar tissue, which makes the injury now irreversible. So don't ever let it get to stage 3. So if you keep doing what you did to get to stage 1, if you keep doing that, they'll get to stage 2, then stage 3. So make sure you intervene to start to correct the challenge. So how do you correct it? Well, first of all, you go to the old basic common sense, is, rest to start with. And when I say rest, doesn't mean you sit on the couch and do nothing and eat donuts and watch the soapies. When I say rest, you take the load off that body part. You keep exercising and training, but don't put direct stress on that tendon. For example, as you can see here, I've got a trusty cross trainer. So instead of doing any running, which will cause aggravation to my plantar fasciitis, then I'll hop on the cross trainer, which doesn't cause that impact. Therefore, I can still exercise, still stay fit, but take the pressure off that particular area. The other aspect, you want to make sure you ice it on a regular basis. So regularly throughout the day, probably around 20 minutes at a time. Don't over ice it, but ice it because that acts as an analgesic, decreases inflammation and promotes the healing process. So you need to rest, that means it's passive, not passive rest, we're talking active rest, means keep exercising, do other things, but just take the load off that joint. Two is that you need to ice it on a regular basis, particularly in the initial stages if there's pain and inflammation, because the tendon won't heal if there's any inflammation. As soon as there's any inflammation, then it won't heal. You need to get the inflammation down, then the body will start to go into an anabolic state, because if you got inflammation that's in a catabolic state, it means it's breaking itself down. You're breaking the tendon down. If there's no inflammation, then it goes into an anabolic state, means the body starts to promote growth and repair. So rest, ice, stretch. So when it's actually rehabilitating and rebuilding and regenerating, make sure it regenerates in a lengthened state. So good passive stretching to keep that flexibility in the tendon so it doesn't become tight. That could aggravate it again down the track. So rest, ice, stretch, and then if you need to, if you want to, whether your body can handle it, maybe some non-steroidal or anti-inflammatory drugs to manage it if you want to accelerate it. And that's up to you. And obviously the extreme cases, you can go to cortisol, but that's going to be under the guidance and the prescription of a physician. So yes, for example, at the moment, Sally Pierce, which is the great hurdler, she's actually coming in the Commonwealth Games. I heard her interview the other day. She says, yeah, I feel it when I'm cold, but once I warm up, I'm fine. So she's probably in stage 1. The Commonwealth Games is coming up, so she's going to bear it and move through it. Maybe take some anti-inflammatory drugs, make sure she doesn't get drug tested for anything illegal, which I'm sure she won't, and she'll perform at her best. But after that, she'll have to go and really manage it properly so she can properly rehabilitate it for the next athletic season if that's what she wants to do. So get on top of it before it gets on top of you. You can't train through these things. If you train through them, you would just end up going over a cliff. You may have some short-term things you need to achieve from a sporting point of view. You try to manage it to get through that sport, but then you need to properly rehabilitate it. Now, in the early stages, it may take 2, 3, 4 weeks for it to fully recover. If you get to stage 2, then it's going to take maybe 4, 5, 6 weeks, maybe longer to recover. But if you get down to the later stages, it can take months to fully recover. I've had a stage where it's taken me 6 months to fully recover some of my significant tendonitis back in 2012. I took some drugs to get through the sport, the World Championships I was competing at. Then I had to take a good 6 months off of bearing weight on those joints to fully recover, and that was fine for 2013. So you need patience, you need to be smart about it, and you need to be progressive about it, and then you'll get on top of it. Tendonitis is not something that you can train through, because if you do that, it won't end well, and that is no cow poo.